Good morning, good morning, good morning. And I hope and that you are excited about today. I am excited. We are beginning a new reading today. We did have some technical difficulties trying to get Facebook Live working, but we're hoping that it is resolved. It is saying that my connection is weak, but I'm going to hope that it hangs in today since we're only going to be doing a short introduction. So, good afternoon. I do apologize that we weren't able to get on at 11 a.m., but we did try several times to use the Facebook Live. So, it is hopefully it will stay working at this point. We are starting a new book, and that is White Like Me by Tim Wise. And our hashtag for this book is going to be Reflections on Race, taken from the subtitle Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Good afternoon for those of you who normally greet me at 11 a.m. I'm going to take a moment to invite some people into the space. And I hope that everyone is doing well today. So if you can hear me and you can see clearly, I will ask that you put up a thumbs up. And let's hope that our broadcast continues without a problem. All right. So Tim Wise is known as a anti-racist activist in the United States. And of course, he is the author of several other books, and he is a frequent media commentator on racial issues. And I wanted to look at, good afternoon, I wanted to look at what was going on with his perception of race and how he got involved in anti-race activism. And I thought this would be a very good place to start. White Like Me. This is actually his own personal memoir and analysis of his own life. So we're going to start here today at the preface. It's not going to be very long, but it's just going to give you an introduction into his work. If you'd like to, I would definitely encourage that you pick up the book yourself, White Like Me by Tim Wise. And in order to follow these teachings through Facebook Live, all you have to do is search the hashtag Reflections on Race. So here we go. What happened to you? It is a question no one likes to hear, seeing as how it typically signifies an assumption on the part of the questioner that something is terribly wrong, something that defies logic and begs for an explanation. It's the kind of query one might get from former classmates on the occasion of one's 20-year high school reunion. Dear God, what happened to you? As a general rule, people don't ask this question of those whom they consider to have dramatically improved themselves physically, emotionally, or professionally. Instead, it is more often asked of those considered to be seriously damaged, as if the only possible answer to the question would be, well, I was dropped on my head as a baby, to which the questioner would then reply, aha, I see. So whenever I'm asked this, I naturally recoil for a moment, assuming that those inquiring about the matter likely want to know what happened to me, only so that they may, having obtained the answer, carefully avoid at whatever cost having it, whatever that may be, happen to them. In my case, however, the cynicism with which I greet the question usually turns out to be unwarranted. Most of the persons who ask me what happened seem to be asking less for reasons of passing judgment than for reasons of genuine confusion. As a white man, born and reared in a society that has always bestowed upon me advantages that it has generally withheld from people of color, I am not expected to think the way I do. I'm not supposed to speak against and agitate in opposition to racism and institutionalized white supremacy. Indeed, for people of color, it is often shocking to see white people even thinking about race, let alone challenging racism. After all, we don't have to spend much time contemplating the subject if we'd rather not. And white folks have made something of a pastime out of ignoring racism, or at least refusing to call it out as a major social problem to be remedied. But for me, ignoring race and racism has never been an option. Even, even when it would have been easier to turn away, there were too many forces and circumstances pulling me back, compelling me to look at the matter square in the face. In my face. Although white Americans often think we've had few first-hand experiences with race, because most of us are so isolated from people of color in our day-to-day lives, the reality is that this isolation is our experience with race. We are all experiencing race because from the beginning of our lives, we have been living in a racialized society in which the color of our skin means something socially, even while it remains largely a matter of biological and genetic irrelevance. Race may be a science fiction, and given the almost complete genetic overlap between persons of various so-called races, it appears to be just that. But it is a social fact that none of us can escape, no matter how much or how little we may speak of it. Just as there were no actual witches in 1692, yet anti-witch persecution was frighteningly real, so too, race can be a falsehood even as racism continues to destroy lives. And on the flip side, to advantage those who are rarely its targets. A few words about terminology. When I speak of whites or white folks, I am referring to those persons typically of European descent who by virtue of skin color or perhaps national origin and culture are able to be perceived as white, members of the dominant racial group in the Western world. I do not consider the white race to be a real thing biologically, as modern science pretty well establishes that there are no truly distinct races, genetically speaking, within the human species. But the white race certainly has meaning in social terms, and in that sense, it is that sense that I use the concept here. As it turns out, this last point is more important than you might think. Almost immediately upon publication, this book's first edition came under fire from various white supremacists and neo-Nazis, who launched a fairly concerted effort to discredit it and me as the author. They sought to do this by jamming the review boards at Amazon with harsh critiques, none of which discussed the content. All in likelihood, none of them had read the book, but which amounted to ad hominem attacks against me as a Jew. As several explained, being Jewish disqualifies me from being white, or writing about my experiences as a white person, since Jews are, to their way of thinking, a distinct race of evildoers that seeks to eradicate Aryan stock from the face of the earth. Of course, on the one hand, and ignoring for a second their Hitler undertones, it is absurd to think that uniquely Jewish genes render Jews separate from real whites, despite our common and recent European ancestry. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And it's even more ridiculous to think that such genes from 1/4 of one's family as with mine can cancel out 3/4 Anglo-Celtic contribution made by the rest of my ancestors. But in truth, the argument is irrelevant, given how I am using the concept of whiteness here. Even if there were something biologically distinct about Jews, this would hardly alter the fact that most Jews, especially in the United States, are sufficiently light-skinned and assimilated so as to be fully functional as whites in the eyes of authority. This wasn't always the case, but it is now. American Jews are, by and large, able to reap the benefits of whiteness and white racial privilege vis-a-vis people of color, in spite of our Jewishness, whether viewed in racial or cultural terms. My claiming to be white, as one detractor put it, was not an attempt on my part to join the cool kids. I wasn't trying to fool anyone. Whiteness is more about how you're likely to be viewed and treated in a white supremacist society than it is about what you are in any meaningful sense. This is why even some very light-skinned folks of color have been able to access white privilege over the years by passing as white or being misperceived as white. Whiteness is, however much cliched the saying may be, largely a social construct. This is a book about that construct and how it plays out in the larger culture. It is not a scientific treaty, and thus it is quite impervious to whatever science may or may not have to say about race now or in the future. As for the concept of privilege here, clarification is also in order. I am not claiming, nor do I believe, that all whites are wealthy and powerful. We live not only in a racialized society, but also in a class system, a patriarchal system, and one of straight supremacy, able-bodied supremacy, Christian hegemony. These other forms of privilege and the oppression experienced by those who can access them mediate but never fully eradicate something like white privilege. So I realized that wealthy whites are more powerful than the poor ones, white men more powerful than white women, able-bodied whites more powerful than those with disabilities, and straight whites, the latter being a term for those who are not transgendered, more powerful than gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered whites. But despite the fact that white privilege plays out differently for different people, depending on these other identities, the fact remains that whiteness matters and carries great advantage. So, for example, although whites are often poor, their poverty does not alter the fact that relative to poor and working class persons of color, they typically have a leg up. In fact, studies suggest that working class whites are typically better off in terms of assets and net worth than even middle class blacks with far higher incomes due to past familial advantages. No one system, no one privilege system trumps all others every time, but no matter the ways in which individual whites may face obstacles on the basis of non-racial factors, our race continues to elevate us over similarly situated persons of color. The notion of privilege is a relative concept as well as an absolute one, a point that is often misunderstood. This is why I can refer to myself as a privileged son, despite coming from a dysfunctional family that was not even close to wealthy. Relative to persons of color, whites receive certain head starts and advantages, none of which are canceled out because of factors like class, gender, or sexual orientation. Likewise, heterosexuals receive privileges relative to LGBT, none of which are canceled out by poverty that many straight people experience. So too, rich folks have certain privileges on the basis of wealth, none of which vanish like mist just because some of those wealthy persons are disabled. While few of us are located only in privileged groups, and even fewer are located only in marginalized or oppressed groups, we are all occasionally privileged and occasionally targets. The fact remains that our status as occasional targets does not relieve the obligation to address the ways in which we receive unjust advantages at the expense of others. As my friend and colleague Jackie Wade puts it, we all have a couple of nickels in the quarter. This book is about my nickels. They are not the only ones, but they are the only ones over which I can take ownership. There would be nothing wrong with someone writing a book like this and dealing only with male privilege, class privilege, Christian privilege, or able-bodied privilege. Likewise, those in other countries could write about privilege and oppressive systems there. Those all would be illuminating, but this book is about white privilege in the United States because it is real and must be confronted. It is not more important than other types of privilege, but it is important enough to merit its own examination. So that is the introduction to White Like Me. Now, as you could tell, Tim Wise definitely has his own thoughts and own views about LGBTQ community. He has his own thoughts and views about Christianity. And so what we're focusing on in his book is definitely talking about, as he calls it, white privilege in the United States. And as he points out, there's all kinds of privileges that can be dissected, but that is the one that this book is primarily going to focus on. So that's why I wanted to start today by reading the preface so you all know as we're reading what his perspective is, why he's chosen to write about this, and that it's strictly going to be coming from his perspective as a white man living in the United States. Some of the things that he said that I want to go back to is something that I've been saying for quite a bit of time, and that is that unfortunately people in our country make a pastime out of ignoring racism, out of ignoring um, the issues of race, right? Or at least refusing, as he says, refusing to call it out as a major social problem to be remedied. And it seems as if, because, as he said, race is a social construct, right? It is a social construct. Technically, as he points out clearly, there's only one human race. But the reality is that because race is a social construct, it is a issue. It is being used in our country, right, to deny people certain things and allow others to have certain privileges. So even though people keep saying, well, race is not really, this whole thing about race is a false idea, it's not false to the people who are being discriminated against because it's being used in a social context, right? It's being used to discriminate socially. It's being used to discriminate economically. And there's plenty of data out here that can show that, which he actually will go into in this book. So I'm excited about that. As he says, race can be a falsehood even as racism continues to destroy lives. Race can be a falsehood even as racism continues to destroy lives. Another thing he says here that I think is really important to point out, he goes on to talk a little bit about Jews and European ancestry, right? He's actually referring to what some would call the Ashkenazi Jews. So when he talks about his Jewish ancestry being European ancestry, he's actually referring to the Ashkenazi Jews, who are Jews of European ancestry, and many of them by conversion. So I just wanted to point that out as we continue on reading. So those are a couple of things that he points out. And as he says, this book, this reading is going to be his experience dissecting and talking about how white privilege in the United States has affected his life, things that he went through that he wants to confront. So this today begins our introduction to White Like Me by Tim Wise, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. I recommend that you get the book if you'd like to read along with us. And you can also follow the hashtag Reflections on Race. That'll be our way of keeping up with the readings as we go further from this point. I hope that you will look up some of the terms that he began to bring out today, such as privilege, such as, what was the other term that he used? White supremacy, such as dominant racial group. And if you don't know who the neo-Nazis are, I encourage you to do a little bit of research on them. I also encourage you to do research on a group that many people don't seem to understand or know who they are. They're called the alt-right. Another group that believes in their supremacy. So I encourage you to do some research on that. So that concludes our preface. Tomorrow we're going to get into his roots. Tim Wise goes into being born to belonging. So that's going to be our subject tomorrow. What does it mean to be born into a society in which you automatically belong? You automatically belong. So thank you guys for joining in with me today. I know we started a little late due to some technical difficulties beyond my control, but I look forward to coming back tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you all for joining me live. Take care and God bless. Again, thank you all for joining me live. Take care and God bless.